My nephew saw me wearing a miniskirt and did something I had never expected. Although I didn't mind it at all, life has a strange way of catching you off guard one minute. Everything feels predictable, almost mundane, and the next you're standing at the edge of a moment you never saw coming. That day was supposed to be like any other. A lazy Saturday spent catching up on chores around the house. But as I now know, some days have a way of unraveling everything you thought you knew about yourself. The afternoon sunlight poured through the living room windows, painting the hardwood floor with warm, golden streaks. The house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the dryer spinning in the laundry room. I'd just finished folding a pile of towels and was about to tackle the closet, a task I'd been putting off for weeks. It was one of those chores that seemed simple on the surface, but had a way of turning into a full-blown project. The moment you started digging in. I stepped into the bedroom and pulled open the closet doors, immediately feeling a pang of regret at the sight of the cluttered mess inside. Clothes I hadn't worn in years hung limply on mismatched hanger, their colors faded from disuse. Boxes of forgotten knickknacks teetered precariously on the top shelf, and shoes I didn't even remember owning were scattered haphazardly across the floor with a sigh. I rolled up my sleeves and got to work sorting items into piles, keep, donate, and toss. I was halfway through the process when I came across it, a skirt I hadn't seen in years. It was a miniskirt, deep black, with a slight shimmer, and it instantly transported me back to another time. A younger, more carefree version of myself had worn that skirt back when nights were filled with laughter and dancing, and mornings didn't come with aching joints and responsibilities. You know, back when I was a bit wilder, I alled it up, inspecting it with a mix of amusement and curiosity. Could it still fit? The thought was absurd. I hadn't worn anything that short in ages, but something about the skirt tugged at me, a whisper of who I used to be. I liked to be like that again for once. On a whim, I decided to try it on more out of curiosity than anything else. But who had thought I would actually go back into those wild times again because of a clothing piece slipping into the skirt? I was surprised by how snug it felt, hugging my curves in ways that both embarrassed and intrigued me. I turned to face the mirror, and for a moment, I didn't recognize the reflection. Staring back, the woman in the mirror looked bold, confident, a far cry from the one who'd spent the last few years buried in routines and obligations. As I smoothed the fabric down over my thighs, a small laugh escaped me. Still got it, I murmured, though my cheeks flushed at the audacity of even thinking that I was about to change back into my usual sweatpants. When the doorbell rang its sharp chime, cutting through the stillness of the house, I froze my heart, skipping a beat. Who could that be? I wasn't expecting anyone. My first instinct was to ignore it, but the bell rang again, more insistent, this time with a sigh. I grabbed a loose cardigan from the bed and threw it on, hoping it would at least somewhat downplay the outfit. When I opened the door, I was met with a familiar face, my nephew Zayan. At 21, Zayan wasn't the lanky teenager I remembered. He'd grown into a confident young man with broad shoulders and a casual charm that seemed to come effortlessly. He stood on the porch, a bag of tools slung over one shoulder, and a crooked smile on his face. "Auntie," he said, his voice warm and teasing. "You called about the leaky sink. Remember the sink?" I'd completely forgotten. I'd asked him to stop by. My mind raced, trying to come up with a response, but Zayan's eyes flicked downward, and for a split second, gone. I saw his expression falter. His gaze lingered for just a moment too long, before he quickly looked away, his cheeks coloring slightly. "Oh, right," I said, stepping aside to let him in. "Thanks for coming, the bathroom's down the hall." As he passed me, I felt an odd tension in the air. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, but it was there, a shift, subtle but undeniable. I shook it off, chalking it up to my own self-consciousness. After all, I wasn't exactly dressed for company, and at that moment, I suddenly asked myself, did I choose this skirt unconsciously because of him? But I shook my head. That couldn't be true. Liam set to work on the sink while I returned to the bedroom, intent on finishing my closet project. But as I sifted through old clothes, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. There was a strange energy in the house, one that made me hyper-aware of every sound, every movement. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the task at hand. But then, Zayn's voice called out from the bathroom, breaking my concentration. "Auntie, can you give me a hand? Real quick." Setting down the sweater I'd been folding, I walked down the hall and stepped into the bathroom. Zayn was crouched by the sink, his sleeves rolled up to reveal his strong forearms, a wrench in one hand. The small space felt even smaller with both of us in it, and I had to fight the urge to step back. "What's up?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "I think the pipe's stuck," he said, motioning to the faucet. "Can you hold this while I try to loosen it?" I nodded, leaning in to grab the faucet as instructed. Our shoulders brushed as he worked, and I felt a warmth radiate from him that caught me off guard. The proximity was innocent enough, but the air between us felt charged, as if we were both acutely aware of how close we were. Liam glanced at me, his eyes lingering for a moment before he looked away. "You look nice today," he said, casually, though his voice held a note of something I couldn't quite place. "Thanks," I replied, my cheeks flushing. "It's just an old skirt I found in the closet. I was going to donate it. Well, it suits you," he said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. I laughed nervously, straightening up as he tightened the last bolt. "All done," he announced, standing and brushing his hands on his jeans. "Should be good as new." "Thanks," I said, stepping back to give him space. "You're a lifesaver." Zayn leaned against the counter, his gaze steady. "You know, I don't think I've ever seen you wear something like that before." I froze, unsure how to respond. His tone wasn't teasing. It was soft, almost thoughtful. I tugged at the hem of the skirt, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "It's just an old thing," I said quickly. "Nothing special?" He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then he smiled, his usual easygoing grin returning. "Well, it looks good on you," he said, his voice low. The words lingered in the air, heavier than they should have been. I quickly turned to leave the bathroom, my heart racing for reasons I didn't fully understand. But as I stepped into the hallway, I felt Zayn's presence close behind me, his footsteps echoing mine, "Auntie." He said, his voice stopping me in my tracks. I turned to face him, my breath catching as our eyes met. "Yeah," he hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "You ever feel like some things happen?" For a reason, Zayn's question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. I blinked, unsure how to respond. "What do you mean?" I asked carefully, trying to keep my voice steady. He hesitated, his gaze flickering to the floor before meeting mine again. "I don't know. Just feels like sometimes things happen the way they're supposed to, even if we don't understand it at first." There was a weight in his words that unsettled me, and I forced a small laugh, brushing it off. "You've been reading too many philosophy books," I teased, stepping past him toward the kitchen. "Come on, I'll grab you something to drink before you head out." Zayn followed me, his footsteps soft against the hardwood floor. The tension from the bathroom still lingered, but I did my best to ignore it, focusing instead on the familiar comfort of routine. I pulled a glass from the cabinet, filling it with water before handing it to him. "Thanks," he said, taking the glass but not drinking. His eyes were on me again, studying me in a way that made my skin prickle. "You know, I wasn't sure if I should come by today." "Why not?" I asked, leaning against the counter. "You're always welcome here." "Zayan, you know that." He shrugged, setting the glass down without taking a sip. "I guess I just didn't want to bother you." "You're not bothering me," I said firmly, though I felt a flicker of doubt. Was he picking up on my unease? Did he sense the shift in the air that I was trying so hard to ignore? Zayan nodded, but his expression remained unreadable. He glanced at the clock, then back at me. "I should probably get going," he said. Finally, "Thanks for letting me help out with the sink." "Of course," I said, relieved to have an excuse to end the conversation drive safe. He gave me a small smile before heading toward the door, but as he reached for the handle, he paused, turning back to look at me. "Auntie." He began, his voice soft. Yes, for a moment, he seemed to wrestle with whatever was on his mind. Then he shook his head, letting out a small laugh. "Never mind. I'll see you later." And just like that, he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty space where he'd been, my thoughts swirling. There was something unspoken between us, something I couldn't quite name, but couldn't deny either. It was unsettling, confusing, and I hated the way it made me feel. I thought it was over, but oh no, this was just the beginning. I had never expected what would come after. I tried to push the thoughts out of my mind, returning to my chores and buying myself with anything that would distract me. But no matter how hard I worked, Zayan's words and the way he'd looked at me kept replaying in my head. That night, as I curled up on the couch with a cup of tea, I finally allowed myself to think about it. Was I overreacting? Had I misinterpreted his intentions? Zayan was family. Surely he didn't mean anything by it, but the memory of his lingering gaze, the soft tone of his voice, and the hesitation in his words refused to fade. Just as I started to convince myself it was nothing, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. I picked it up, my heart skipping a beat when I saw Zayan's name on the screen. "Hey, Auntie, can I ask you something?" I stared at the message, my mind racing. Why was he texting me now? What could he possibly have to ask? After a moment's hesitation, I typed back a simple response. "Of course. What's on your mind?" His reply came almost instantly. "I just keep thinking about today. You looked different." It surprised me. I guess my stomach twisted as I read the message, different. How? I typed back. Though part of me didn't want to know the answer, there was a pause, a long one, before his next message appeared. "I don't know, you just seemed confident, like you were glowing or something." I blinked at the screen, unsure how to respond. Was this a harmless compliment, or was there something more to it? My fingers hovered over the keyboard, debating how to reply. Finally, I settled on something neutral. I was just trying on old clothes, nothing serious. He read the message immediately, and I watched as the typing bubble appeared and disappeared several times. When his response finally came through, it made my breath catch. "You looked really good." I mean it. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the words. This wasn't normal. This wasn't the kind of thing a nephew should say to his aunt, and yet I couldn't bring myself to shut it down outright. Instead, I typed back, "Thanks. Zayan, that's sweet of you to say. I hoped that would be the end of it. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be." Sure enough, another message popped up moments later. "I don't know if I should say this, but I felt something today, did you?" My breath caught my fingers trembling as I read the message. This was crossing into dangerous territory, and I didn't know how to handle it. Zayan wasn't just anyone. He was family, whatever he thought he was feeling. It wasn't right, but instead of shutting him down immediately, I found myself hesitating. Finally, I typed back, "Zayan, I think you're confused whatever you're feeling. It's not real, it's just misplaced." His response came quickly. "Maybe, but I can't stop thinking about it. I'm sorry if this makes you uncomfortable. I just needed to tell you. I set my phone down, my hands shaking. The room felt colder, the air heavier. What had started as a simple visit to fix a sink had turned into something I couldn't quite comprehend. I wanted to believe Zayan would let it go, that he'd move past whatever this was, but as I sat there staring at the unanswered message on my phone, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Then the next morning, I woke up with a heavy feeling in my chest. The sunlight streaming through the curtains felt intrusive, as if it were shining a spotlight on all the things I didn't want to face. Zayan's messages from the night before still lingered in my mind, replaying over and over like a song stuck on repeat. I had thought ignoring him would put an end to the strange tension, but the silence only seemed to make it worse. I busied myself with my usual routine, trying to find solace in the monotony of the day, coffee, laundry, tidying up the kitchen. But every so often, I'd catch myself glancing at my phone, half dreading and half expecting another message from Zayan. By mid-morning, I convinced myself that maybe it was over. Maybe he'd come to his senses and decided to move on. But then there was a knock at the door. My stomach dropped. It was too early for mail, and I wasn't expecting anyone else. A nervous energy buzzed through me as I made my way to the front door. When I opened it there, he was Zayan standing on the porch with his hands shoved deep into his pockets. His posture, both casual and uncertain. "Liam?" I said, my voice betraying my surprise. "What are you doing here?" "I was in the neighborhood," he said quickly, his words rushed and unconvincing. "Thought I'd stop by." I stared at him, trying to read his expression, but it was guarded. "You live 20 minutes away," I pointed out, stepping aside to let him in. "Since when do you come to this neighborhood?" He shrugged, avoiding my gaze. "I just wanted to check in, see how you're doing." I closed the door behind him, a mix of unease and frustration bubbling inside me. "I'm fine," I said, crossing my arms. "You could have texted." "Yeah, I know." He glanced around the room, fidgeting slightly. Justin needed to see you." My heart pounded, a warning bell ringing in my mind. "Zayan," I began, my tone firmer. "Now we need to talk." He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine about last night. "Yes," I said, taking a deep breath. "What you said, it's not appropriate. You're my nephew, Zayan, whatever you think you're feeling. It's not right." "I know," he said quickly, his voice laced with frustration. "I know it's not right. I've been telling myself that over and over, but it doesn't change how I feel." I shook my head, backing away slightly, as if distance could somehow diffuse the tension. "You're confused. You're projecting something onto me that isn't real." "It feels real," he said, stepping closer. "I can't stop thinking about you. Auntie, you're everything." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind scrambled for the right thing to say, something that would shut this down without breaking him. "Zayan, listen to me," I said, my voice trembling. "This isn't love. It's misplaced affection. I care about you, but not in the way you're thinking. Look, I feel it as well, but we have to ignore it." He ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "I'm not asking for anything. Okay, I needed you to know. I needed to say it out loud." "Well, you've said it," I replied, my tones sharper than I intended. "And now you need to stop for your sake and mine." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us was thick, charged with unspoken emotions that I couldn't bring myself to acknowledge. Finally, Zayan nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll leave." He turned toward the door, and for a fleeting moment I felt a pang of guilt. He looked so young, so vulnerable, and I hated the thought of pushing him away, but I knew it was necessary. This was a line that couldn't be crossed, no matter how much it hurt to enforce it. "Liam," I called out. Just as he reached the door, he stopped, glancing back over his shoulder. "Yeah, I care about you," I said softly. He nodded, his expression unreadable. "I care about you too, Auntie." And with that, he was gone again, leaving behind an emptiness that I couldn't quite explain. I sank onto the couch, my head in my hands, as the reality of what had just happened settled over me. Liam wasn't just some stranger with misplaced feelings. He was family, and I had no idea how to navigate this without losing the bond. We'd shared something in me, told me I wanted him. I didn't think of it to give in to that at that moment. Not yet. I guess I needed some time for that. And that night, as I lay in bed, I kept replaying our conversation in my mind. Had I been too harsh, too dismissive? Or had I done the right thing by shutting him down? The questions swirled in my mind, refusing to let me rest. When my phone buzzed on the nightstand, I felt a jolt of both dread and anticipation. Sure enough, it was Zion. "I'm sorry." The message read, "I didn't mean to make things harder for you. I just needed to tell you the truth." I stared at the screen, unsure how to respond. My instincts told me to leave it alone, to let the silence speak for itself. But another part of me, the part that had always cared too much, couldn't ignore it. "I understand," I typed back, "but this has to stop, Zayn, for both of us." His reply came almost instantly. "I know I'll try, but I can't promise. It'll be easy." I set the phone down, my hands trembling. This wasn't over. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, an unshakable certainty that this was only the beginning of something far more complicated than I was prepared to handle. The following days felt like a strange limbo. Zion didn't reach out again, and while I was grateful for the silence, it also left me uneasy. The tension hadn't disappeared. It had only shifted into something quieter, heavier. I threw myself into work errands and anything else that could distract me from the swirling thoughts. I couldn't seem to escape, but no matter how busy I kept myself, the memories lingered. His words, his gaze, the raw vulnerability in his voice. Then, just as I started to think the silence might last, he showed up again. It was late afternoon, and I was in the kitchen prepping dinner when I heard the knock at the door. My heart sank immediately, the familiar apprehension settling over me like a heavy blanket. I wiped my hands on a towel, hesitating for a moment before making my way to the door. When I opened it there, he was Zion, standing on the porch with his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. "Zion?" I said, my voice betraying my surprise. "What are you doing here?" "I needed to see you," he said simply, his tone calm but resolute. I couldn't leave things the way they were. I stepped aside, letting him in despite the unease twisting in my stomach. "We talked about this," I said, closing the door behind him. "I thought we agreed to take some space." "I know," he said, turning to face me, "and I've been trying, but I can't stop thinking about you. Auntie, it's like you're always in my head." "I'm sorry," I crossed my arms, leaning against the door as I tried to steady my nerves. "Zion, we can't keep having this conversation. You're my nephew. It's not right. I know it's not," he said, his voice rising slightly. "Do you think I don't know that? But knowing doesn't change how I feel. I care about you more than anyone else, and I can't just pretend that I don't." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, I was at a loss for what to say. "Come in." "Zion," I said while I closed the door. "This isn't fair," I said finally, my voice trembling. "It's not fair to me or to you. You need to let this go." "Zion, I've tried," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "But I don't know how. You're the only person who's ever really been there for me. Auntie, you've always cared, always understood me in a way no one else does. How am I supposed to—" Just let that go? I closed my eyes, a wave of guilt washing over me. I wanted to tell him that he was wrong, that his feelings were misplaced and temporary. But deep down, I knew this wasn't something that could be fixed with a few simple words. Zion, I said softly, stepping closer to him. I care about you too, but not like this. You're confusing admiration and gratitude with something else, and it's not healthy for either of us. He shook his head, his jaw tightening. You think this is just some phase that I'll wake up one day and it'll be gone. I think you're putting me on a pedestal. I said, my voice firmer now, and that's not fair to me. I'm not perfect. Liam, I'm just a person trying to do my best. For a moment, he didn't respond. He just stood there, his hands clenched at his sides, his expression a mix of frustration and pain. Then finally, he nodded. Maybe you're right, he said quietly, but that doesn't make it any easier. I know, I said, my tone softening, but you need to take some time for yourself. Focus on your life, your goals. This isn't the path for either of us. He looked at me then, his eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't quite name. You're not going to push me away completely, are you? No, I said firmly. I'll always be here for you. Zion, but we need boundaries for both our sakes. He nodded slowly, the tension in his posture easing slightly. Okay, he said. I'll try. We stood there for a moment, the silence between us, heavy, but not as sharp as it had been before. It felt like an understanding had been reached, fragile but real. I walked him to the door, and as he stepped onto the porch, he turned back to look at me. Thank you, he said quietly, for listening, for not just shutting me out. I managed a small smile. Take care of yourself, Zion. As he walked away, I closed the door, leaning against it as a wave of exhaustion washed over me. It wasn't a resolution, not really, but it was a start for the first time in days. I felt a glimmer of hope that we might find a way through this without losing the bond we'd always shared. But that hope was short-lived. Later that evening, just as I was settling in for the night, my phone buzzed with a text. I picked it up, expecting a message from a friend or a work reminder, but it was from Zion. I'm sorry. Auntie, I know I said I'd try, but I can't stop thinking about you. I don't know what to do. I think back of you wearing that skirt, you just looked so good. It was as if you were young and wild again. My heart sank as I stared at the screen, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I typed back quickly, hoping to shut it down before it spiraled further. Zion, we've already talked about this. You need to let it go. And yes, I know I looked good, and to be honest, I do felt a lot wilder wearing that skirt. If I'm honest, his reply came almost instantly. I'm trying, but it's like, the more I try, the harder it gets. I need to see you. I set the phone down, my hands trembling. This wasn't over. It was becoming clear that Zion wasn't ready to move on, and I didn't know how to help him without making things worse. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, a knot of dread settled in my stomach. Maybe I just had to invite him to my house so that we could talk, and maybe even more than that. The following morning, I woke to the sound of my phone vibrating on the nightstand. I groaned, rolling over to check the screen, expecting a work email or a reminder. Instead, Zion's name flashed across the display. A knot of unease settled in my stomach as I sat up debating whether to answer. When I finally picked up, his voice came through. Quiet, but urgent, Auntie, he said. Can I come by? I know it's early, but I need to talk to you. I hesitated, my mind racing. I wanted to tell him no, to insist on more space between us. But something in his tone, vulnerable, almost pleading, stopped me all right. I said, finally come over. He arrived within half an hour, his car pulling into a driveway just as I finished my coffee. I opened the door before he had a chance to knock, stepping aside to let him in. His face was pale, his usual confidence replaced by a nervous energy that made me uneasy. He looked at me as he saw I was wearing the skirt again. I could see him looking at me. "What's going on? Anything wrong with that?" I asked. As he stepped into the living room, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He didn't answer right away, instead pacing the room like he was trying to gather his thoughts. Finally, he stopped turning to face me. "I've been thinking a lot." He began, his voice strained about us, about everything I've said. "Liam." I interrupted, my tone firm. "We've already talked about this. I thought we agreed to take some space." "I know," he said quickly, holding up his hands, "and I've tried. I swear, but it's not working. I can't get you out of my head." "Auntie, every time I try to move on, it just comes back." I sighed, crossing my arms as I leaned against the back of the couch. "Zayan, I care about you, but this isn't healthy. You're holding onto something that isn't real." He shook his head, his frustration evident. "It feels real to me, and I know you feel something too. You didn't deny it." I froze, his words hitting me like a thunderclap. "What are you talking about?" "The way you look at me," he said, stepping closer. "The way you hesitated. When I asked if you felt anything, you didn't say no, Auntie, and that's what's been driving me crazy. I need to know the truth." I felt the ground shift beneath me, a wave of guilt and confusion washing over me. "Zayan, this isn't about feelings. It's about what's right and wrong. You're my nephew. This, whatever you think this is, it can't happen." His shoulders slumped, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I know," he said quietly. "I know it's wrong, but I had to say it. I had to let you know how I feel, even if it means losing you." "You're not going to lose me," I said, my voice softening, "but you need to let this go for both our sakes." The silence that followed was heavy, the air between us charged with unspoken emotions. Finally, Zayan nodded, his expression one of resignation. "Okay," he said, "I'll try." I turned to face him, crossing my arms, as if the gesture could shield me from the storm brewing in his eyes. "Zayan, this isn't right. You know that even though we both may like it, it isn't right." "I know it's not," he said, stepping closer, "but that doesn't make it any less real." His presence felt overwhelming, the air between us. Charged with an intensity I couldn't ignore, I backed away, instinctively retreating toward the living room, but he followed, his gaze locked on mine. "Zayan, please," I said, my voice trembling. "You're my nephew. This can't happen." "Why not?" he asked, his voice breaking. "You keep telling me it's wrong, but you've never said you don't feel anything. You can't keep denying it." "Auntie, I see it in you. Our eyes." I froze, his words cutting through me like a blade. "Zayan, this isn't about feelings. It's about doing what's right, and this isn't right then. Tell me you don't feel anything." He challenged, his voice low. "Look me in the eyes and tell me there's nothing there." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The truth, the one I'd been avoiding, loomed between us, undeniable and impossible to ignore. My silence spoke louder than any denial, and I saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Auntie," he murmured, stepping closer. His hand reached out, rushing against mine, and the touch sent a jolt through me. "I care about you more than I've ever cared about anyone. I know it's not supposed to be this way, but I can't help it, and I don't think you can either. I should have pulled away, should have told him to leave, but I couldn't move." The intensity of his gaze held me in place, my resolve crumbling under the weight of everything we'd been holding back. "Zayan," I said, my voice barely audible. "It feels right," he said, his voice trembling. "Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me to leave and I will." His hand lingered on mine, his touch warm and steady. I looked up at him, my breath catching as our eyes met. The space between us seemed to shrink, the tension pulling us closer, despite every logical reason to resist. The words caught in my throat, my mind warring with my heart. But before I could finish, he leaned in his lips, brushing against mine in a kiss that was both tentative and charged with emotion. For a moment, I froze, caught in the whirlwind of sensation and disbelief. But then something inside me gave way, and I found myself responding the weight of our shared tension. Finally, breaking the kiss deepened his hands, moving to my waist. As he pulled me closer, it went from bad to worse. He looked at the skirt, and we both knew what he meant. This was amazing. Even though it may be wrong, it didn't feel so. It felt good. It felt very good. The world around us seemed to fade. The only thing that mattered was the connection we'd fought so hard to deny. It was overwhelming, a rush of emotions and sensations that left me breathless. I felt his hand slide up my back, his touch firm yet gentle, and I shivered under the intensity of it all. "Zion," I murmured, pulling back slightly to catch my breath. "I know," he said, his forehead resting against mine. "But I can't stop. I don't want to stop." Neither did I, at least not in that moment. The lines we'd drawn had blurred completely, leaving us standing on the edge of something we couldn't take back. I knew there would be consequences, that this would change everything. But for once, I let myself stop thinking and just feel as the moments stretched into something deeper. The weight of our connection became undeniable. It wasn't just about attraction or longing. It was about understanding, about filling a void we hadn't even realized was there. And in that moment, nothing else mattered until this day. I don't know if it is okay what we did since then. I haven't touched the skirt anymore. Do you think it is wrong what I did? Please tell me in the comments. Thank you so much.